Hello and welcome to the Christian Book Collective, a space where readers and writers unite, and where I, your host, Lydia Houghton, interview some of your favourite Christian authors. Today's episode is a long one, and I do have the feeling that we could have spoken for even longer. It was a fascinating conversation. I was privileged to speak with author, speaker Michael Ots, who's penned multiple books, but specifically in today's episode, we were focusing on his book, Making Sense of Life. As is the case with all the books that I talk about, showcase on these podcast episodes, I highly recommend that you go and read this book, and I hope you enjoy the episode. The first question is just a general one, but I thought it would be good to kind of kick the conversation off. So, what led you to write Making Sense of Life, Michael?
Yeah, it was my fourth book that I've written, and I had written a couple of books that dealt with the kind of questions that people have about Christianity and the kind of intellectual questions about the truth claims of Christianity and also the moral objections people have. But one of the things I'd kind of noticed increasingly as I was chatting to people is that a lot of people that I met didn't necessarily have questions about Christianity. Often because we now live in such a kind of secularized culture that a lot of people have never even thought about or engaged much with the Christian faith. So it wasn't that they were kind of coming with objections to Christianity that they needed answers to. It was more like they just hadn't even thought about it. They hadn't thought that Christian faith might have relevance to life. And so I found myself in this situation where I'd be chatting to people and I kind of wanted to give them a copy of my book, but I kind of thought this book isn't really relevant to them because they're not asking the questions that this book is answering. So I thought, well, what are the questions that people are asking? And I thought, well, actually, even though people aren't necessarily asking questions about God, they are still asking questions about life. They may not be asking, why does God allow suffering? But they're asking, like, why is there so much suffering in the world? Is there hope in the face of it? Or they may not be asking, is Jesus the only way to heaven? But they might be thinking about, how we can have peace in a world where there's so many different truth claims and that kind of thing. So I was really trying to take the kind of questions that I realized the people around me had, not necessarily immediately God questions, we might call them, but just life questions, and then try and show how the Christian faith in general and Jesus in particular gives answers to those questions and how actually the gospel is the thing that makes sense of all of these different aspects of life.
That's so interesting, and it actually links really well to my next question. So, we were chatting a little bit about this before the
Mm.
podcast started, but I had the pleasure of meeting you at the Manchester Christian Union's Events Week in 2023. So, as someone who does so much work with university students, and you referred to it a little bit there, but
Mm.
those issues that aren't necessarily kind of Christian questions,
Mm.
can you list some of those key issues that you found kind of matter most to young adults today and the questions they do have questions about those things?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry. Big crash there. It was my charger falling off the off the table. Yeah, absolutely. I think there are, as I said, questions that people are asking now are not necessarily God questions, but they're life questions, and I think they reflect a kind of change in culture as well. So, um, uh, a lot of questions people are asking are about the um, society in which we live. We see that we're increasingly polarized as a society. We see that in politics, we see that on social media. And so, questions about how we can actually learn to get along with each other. How can we have a harmonious society when we seem to be getting increasingly polarized and ever further apart from each other? I mean, social media was kind of billed as the thing that would bring us together, and yet, ironically, it's kind of like made us further apart and in many ways. So questions about that. I think questions about mental health, loneliness, and anxiety. When I was a kid, people used to talk about the elderly as the people who had the problem of loneliness. But actually now it's like Generation Z who are twice as likely to be lonely as their grandparents. So loneliness is much a greater problem for student age people. And connected to that, questions about, yeah, how do I find real connection? Again, like, social media promised to bring us together, but actually there are higher levels of anxiety, and mental health among people who use social media. In fact, there's a kind of direct correlation. Now, whether that's a causation or whether it's just a consequence, yeah, you could debate that. I think other questions that people ask are questions about the future. Again, statistics would show that people are increasingly pessimistic about the future. And I think that's certainly been the case in the last 5 years. So until COVID, I think basically we used to watch the news out of interest into terms of what's happening around the world, but it never really affected us. Our lives just went along the same. Nothing out there really had any impact upon what was going to happen to me. And then suddenly COVID came along, and suddenly like our lives were impacted by the stuff we were watching on the news, and we all ended up in lockdown. And then, of course, you've got the war in Ukraine, and you look at a war not on the far side of the world in another continent, but one in our own continent that has massive potential to blow up into something bigger. And that's obviously very relevant right at this moment with everything in the news this week. So I think it suddenly makes people feel a lot more vulnerable. I don't think many students worried that they were going to die of COVID, but they were worried that stuff was going to, like life was no longer predictable. We don't know what the future holds. The economy is uncertain and all of these things. And so that level of kind of fragility and uncertainty about the future, um, I think, raises all sorts of questions in terms of where can I find security? Um, is there hope for the future? Can we feel hopeful? That kind of those kind of things. So I think there's been a real shift in terms of, like we said, the questions that people are asking, but questions around anxiety about the future, loneliness, mental health, I think are huge, particularly in university campuses.
So interesting. And you just wonder kind of, I mean, you mentioned it briefly, but kind of how much of those questions, I don't know, came about during the pandemic or stem from that, or that shift is really, really interesting. And just at the fast pace that kind of technology and social media and everything is moving, it's interesting if you were to compare those questions with questions that might have been had, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. But obviously, there'll be fundamental ideas that are the same. And just going back a little bit, you mentioned loneliness,
Mm,
and I've just read the book that you contributed to, Have You Ever Wondered,
mm.
by, well, edited by Andy Bannister and Gavin Matthews. I am right in remembering that your chapter was, one of your chapters was about loneliness in that book.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
because I was so struck by what you wrote about how we can view it as kind of time alone, or we can view it as solitude to be spent with
Mm,
God. That
mm,
was a really interesting idea.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I on that, it really struck me. It was basically from a book that I'd read, uh, a biography of loneliness, by Faybound Alberti, and she talked about how in the past people just didn't use this word lonely. It's quite a relatively modern conception, the idea of feeling lonely. And her point was not that people were never on their own, although actually, like living on our own is a much more of a modern concept. Like I guess people were less on their own, but um, they were not never on their own. But they used this word solitude, and whereas loneliness almost always has negative connotations, solitude has positive connotations. But her point is actually, if you have some kind of faith, then solitude is often a part of it. Um, and actually, if you're a Christian, being on your own can be the time that you can spend, obviously, um, with God, and not seeing that as a negative thing in any sense. So yeah, I think a massive distinction, and obviously then raises the question, like, in a society that tried to get rid of God, where do we go when we're on our own? You really are on your own if that is the case.
Wow, that's really scary. I remember it really struck me when I read it because honestly, it's one of those quotes that stays with you from a book.
Mm,
The bit I read kind of about solitude. And since then, when I've been by myself, I've been like, well, I'm not really by myself as a Christian. God is here. This is a great opportunity. And it's
mm,
sad that not everyone can get to that from,
yeah,
oh, I'm by myself. Yeah.
yeah.
One of the chapters going back to making sense of life that particularly stood out to me was the chapter entitled Making Sense of Humanity, and the subheading, What Makes Humans Worthy of Human Rights? So you write about the idea that the very concept of human rights is based on the Christian faith. And for those listening who might not have read the book yet, can you tell us a little bit more about this idea, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely. So human rights, obviously, it's such a kind of given, isn't it, that we talk in our society as if we have rights. You know, people complain that they're getting treated like an animal, which is kind of interesting because the narrative that we are taught from the moment we kind of go through school is that we are just an animal. We're just a highly evolved animal. So why do we complain that we get treated like animals if we're just highly complex animals? On what basis do we talk about the sense that people should have human rights? And this ties into all sorts of things, arguments about equality, um, whether that's kind of racial equality or gender equality. Again, built on this assumption that people have inherent value and they shouldn't be discriminated against and so on. But what most people have never done is to stop and think, well, where does that come from? If you look back through history and if you look to some extent around the world today, it's not taken as like just inherently obvious that all humans have equal dignity. In fact, if you look at Roman society before the advent of Christianity, like people would have laughed at that idea. They said it was absolutely stupid idea. They'd say like it's clear, isn't it, that the Greeks would have said some people are obviously born to be masters, and other people are born into slavery, and you just find your place in life and your value or lack of it accordingly. So where did we get this idea from? And I kind of quote quite a bit in the book from a secular historian called Tom Holland, who uh, basically says we get this idea because of Christianity. It was the Christian Revolution that transformed the way we view human beings and ourselves as human beings. And not, I mean, Tom Holland's very sympathetic to the Christian faith, but you could take someone who's far less sympathetic, someone like Yuval Noah Harari, who's quite an outspoken atheist. But again, he would say, the whole idea of human rights is just a myth based on Christianity. Now, interestingly, he thinks that human rights are a useful myth. Like he's not saying we should get rid of them. Although ironically, like if he is exposing that it's just a myth, then like on what basis does he think that we should continue to adhere to this idea if like ultimately it's just based on a myth? So there's kind of from people who've looked into it, this common understanding, yeah, this didn't just come from nowhere. This didn't just evolve by accident. This came about because of the Christian faith. Um, and obviously, in the Judeo-Christian worldview, it starts with God creating human beings in His image. So there's a differentiation of the human race from anything else that God created. Not to say that other things aren't important, but there is something unique about human beings that isn't true of other things that God created. But then in the heart of the Christian story, this concept that God becomes human, becomes one of the human race, um, is something that elevates our humanity even further. And then the revolution of the early Christian movements, where male and female, Jew and Gentile, slave and free were all considered one in Christ Jesus. The early Christian communities that flattened out and democratized, what would have been a hierarchical society. Um, is just really revolutionary. And in my experience, a lot of people have never stopped to think about where that's come from. And so, as someone said, like we've got the fruit of the Christian faith, but we've never thought about the root of it. Where does it, come back from? Now, I guess one of the questions you can ask is if you cut the fruit from the root, like what happens? Like we kind of like as a society have been saying for the last 50 years, like, oh, we want to move on from Christianity. But what happens if you do that? Well, if you cut off the root, like one social commentator talked about living in a cut flower society. If you cut a flower off, it will still flower for a while, but it will die because it's no longer connected to its roots.
Mm.
And we have all these fruits of the Christian faith, but how long can you enjoy them if you have cut yourself off from the root from which it comes? And so I think we take as like an automatic things like human rights, um, but I'm not sure that that would necessarily continue that way if you don't have the basis for it still in society.
Mm. So interesting. It reminds me just, as a Christian of, living the way that Christ calls us to live. I know for me,
Mm,
certainly, well, for Christians, it just isn't possible if we're not getting our strength from God, and it's
Mm,
all by his power, isn't it? That's a really, really interesting concept. I think I definitely hadn't thought about kind of where it came from until I read that chapter
mm,
in your book.
mm,
Similarly,
mm,
there's another chapter in your book
yeah,
on the environment, and that is genuinely something that I had not considered
mm,
before reading your book. I remember my sister would talk about it quite a lot, and
mm,
what should our view on the environment be from a Christian perspective? And I just wouldn't really
mm,
be listening to what she was saying, which was wrong of me because I came to the chapter in your book and I thought,
mm.
oh, we must think about this. So the subheading reads, where does our commitment to the environment come from? So, Michael, can you describe to everyone listening where we should land? Like, where should we land as Christians when thinking about the environment?
Oh yeah. Wow. Yeah, this is such a big one, isn't it? And again,
Mm.
like I think this we talked at the beginning about people's anxiety about the future. People talk about climate anxiety now, and this is a massive contributing factor towards kind of levels of anxiety. And I think what's really interesting is that a lot of the conversation about the environment kind of flows out of this sense of um, fear and anxiety about the future. And some of that is potentially understandable. Um, and given, given the situation we're in, but also it's not always very healthy. I remember Greta Thunberg, like, it was quite, you get kind of became a meme, didn't it? I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic was her line. And this sense of like we need to really panic and be anxious because if we don't do something, um, we're going to be in a mess. Now, what's interesting is other people react and they say, "Oh, it's all dead rubbish. Like we shouldn't do anything." And so the environment, like conversation around the environment, is often very polarized. Um, and it's a symptom of what we are talking about earlier in terms of the division in society. So you've got on the one hand people who are very, very anxious about the environment and saying like if we don't do something the world's going to end by next Friday, and other people who are saying like, oh, chill out, like everything's fine, like nothing's going to change, we can't really impact it anyway. And um and I kind of have a concern about both because I think uh like as Christians, we are called to care for the environment, and we'll look at that in a second. But at the same time, I think sometimes people can overstate the case of the situation we're in an effort to try and mobilize people to do stuff. But in a sense, what they do is they undermine the case. And I was always told, like as a Christian apologist, if you overstate your case, you will undermine it, because
Mm,
people will say, well, actually, that's not true, so we'll throw the whole thing out. And I think there's a degree of that in the environmental movement, in a desire to try and mobilize people to like care about the environment. We try and make it sound as bad as possible so that people will be as scared as possible so they will do something. And what I'm trying to say in the book is that like we should care about the environment, but actually a Christian concern for the environment doesn't have to come just from fear. Um, or anxiety. In fact, quite the opposite. I want to say, like, a Christian concern for the environment is something that comes out of our hope for the world,
mm,
because the Christian view of creation is that not only did God make it initially, so it is inherently good, although it's been warped and distorted by sin, but God will restore it one day. And so we have this hope for creation in the future. We're not looking forward to just everything, being annihilated, but there is hope and redemption for creation. So we can be really, really hopeful about the future. And out of that hope, we can therefore act. Um, and actually, our obligation to care for the environment comes from the fact that um, God has given us that responsibility. God created it. It belongs to Him, but He has given it to us to look after. And I can't remember where it was in that book or another book I wrote about it, and I talked about how it's like when you buy a house, you might have it on leasehold. Like you're kind of looking after it, but someone else, is the ultimate owner. And it's like, well, it's like that with the world. It's like we are responsible for it, but ultimately it belongs to God. Um, but if you take that out, if you don't have a view of this world belongs to God and we are to steward it and look after it because we are like given that responsibility, how are you going to motivate people to care for the environment? Um, and the thing is, if you just tell people like, well, if you don't care for the environment in 10,000 years' time, things might not be so nice. No one cares about 10,000 years' time. Um, so then you have to try and get people to care. And how do you get people to care? Well, you say, well, this is going to affect your children, or even worse, it's going to affect you. Like, so the more sensational you can make it, the more you can try and mobilize people to act. And so I think the motivation is good. Like, we want to get people to care for the environment, but often we then sensationalize things, which I think kind of undermines it, which then leads to this whole kind of kind of uh, uh, hostility we get between kind of one side and the other side. And I think, like, whatever you think about the imminence of, um, climate change and the impact of that and whatever, like, the bottom line is, if God created this world, He's created us to look for us to look after, and so we should. Even if that's not going to affect me in 50 years' time. In fact, there's another book I was reading recently called uh, oh, A Different Shade of Green, by a guy called Gordon Wilson, looking at the environmental issue. And he made an interesting point that it's very easy to get people to care for panda bears because panda bears are cuddly. So, like, you just need to stick a picture of a panda bear and people will give their money to care for a panda bear. Um, but he was saying, like, the thing is, like, if God created everything, then we should care about everything, even when it's not cute. So, and it was just an interesting
Mm.
thought, which is like, actually, a conviction that God is creator of everything means we should care about all aspects of God's creation, not just the bits we find aesthetically pleasing or,
Wow.
we're particularly interested in. So I just think, yeah, a
Wow.
Christian conception of the world gives us a much better motivation and a more hopeful
Mm.
motivation to be caring for the environment. And hopefully we'd also get away from some of the more sensationalizing um, stuff. And I think also take away some of that level of anxiety that people can then have as a consequence.
Wow, that was so helpful. Thank you. When you were talking about motivation, it feels like that's going back to what you were saying about the root and the fruit
Mm.
as well.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I think it's so in a sense you could say, like, why do we care for the environment? I'd say like that stems out of our Christian worldview.
Mm.
Um, I'm not saying you have to be Christian to care for the environment. That's obviously not true. But equally, you don't have to be Christian to believe in human rights. But Tom
Mm.
Holland's point would be, like, if it wasn't for the Christian Revolution, would we have this way of looking at the world? And so, one of the impacts of Christianity is it shaped the way we think, even though we don't. So his point would be, like, we're actually all more Christian than we think we are to some degree, um, like in terms of the way we look at the world, but we've just not thought about where that comes from.
Wow. I I was doing a bit of writing today for Speak Life and I was watching one of their YouTube videos and a celebrity, so it was more explicit than kind of what you're saying, but a celebrity was saying that they don't know what the burning bush has to do with them, but
Mm,
Jesus's words on loving your neighbor he could get behind. And that's
mm,
kind of a similar idea. Like
mm,
obviously we want people
mm,
to read the Bible and see Jesus. But,
mm,
there are non-Christians who potentially more explicitly than, believing in the concept of human rights, but actually seeing the commands of Jesus and saying, this is incredible teaching. And of course, we believe he's the Son of God. It's not just
mm,
incredible teaching, but that's really, really interesting. I wonder if there are any non-Christians listening who might, I don't know, think what parts of my thinking could be influenced by Christian
mm,
culture, by the Bible?
mm, mm,
You've definitely touched on this, but if there's anything else you'd like to add, I just wanted to ask,
mm.
is it important for us as Christians to engage with what society and culture has to say about the big questions of life and why?
Um, yeah, absolutely. Because I think, where would I start? Um, as a Christian, I want to share the good news of Jesus, and I hope that if we've come to discover the good news of Jesus, that's a conviction we all share. But I think one of the big challenges we have is, like, well, how do we do that? How do we connect it? How do we show people that the Christian faith is good news? Um, like, it is good news, but how do we help people to see that? Um, and often a lot of people see the Christian faith as a kind of like hobby that people do on Sundays. It's like, oh, you do Christianity, I do yoga. Like, you do Christianity, I go to football or whatever. And as if it had no connection with the rest of life. Might be nice for you and might even be beneficial, but that's nice for you. And I think what I'm trying to say in the book and what I think we need to be able to say is like Christianity is not just this nice hobby, like it is the thing that makes sense of all of life. And so hopefully as we start to dig deeply into what people are thinking about life and what people are talking about, there are bridges from everything to the gospel. I remember a friend once said, any serious conversation is only ever 2 inches from the gospel. And what they meant by that is like, because, you know, we often think of, the gospel as either just the books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or the gospel as in the core of the gospel, Jesus died and rose again. And that's true. That is the heart of the gospel. But also there's a sense in which the gospel is everything, isn't it? It's everything from
Mm.
the creation of the world to the redemption of the world. And so if the gospel is the story of everything from creation to new creation and everything in between, then everything's connected to the gospel. There's nothing that's disconnected. Um, our job as Christians is to think about what's going on and think, well, as a Christian, what have I got to say into that? How does that connect to the gospel? And then hopefully that means that as we're having conversations with people, we're able to not say to people, stop being interested in what you're interested in and now be interested in what I'm interested in. But it's saying like, no, it's great that you're really interested in this. Have you really thought about why that's so interesting? Like, dig a little deeper. Have you ever thought about where that comes from? And often, like we say with the environment or human rights or whatever, there are things that people are really passionate about, but they've never actually stopped to properly think about why that is the case. And so, yeah, rather than saying to people, come over and just be interested in what I'm interested in, it's saying, no, I'm showing interest in this, and I want you to think even more deeply. And then can you see actually this connects to the gospel? So building a bridge from whatever issues people are thinking about and trying to show how that gets to the gospel.
Mm. That is so interesting and so helpful, and goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning about, people might not have questions, quote unquote, about Christianity, but actually, there are questions like in the book,
Mm.
any question, we can pretty much get to Jesus, which is wonderful. Just changing direction ever so slightly. We were talking about this before the podcast started, but you attend and speak at lots of Christian Union events weeks. So for people who might not know, I don't know, what's a good way of defining a Christian Union? A gathering of Christians?
So they're basically Christian student groups who meet normally on campus from different churches, but united by their faith in Jesus and their desire to share what they've discovered about Jesus with their friends at university. They've been going for over 100 years, so it's a movement that started in the UK but has spread all over the world. I get to work with Christian student groups here in the UK, but also in other parts of continental Europe as well. Um, and as I say, the purpose really was to, as a group of Christian students, to think about how they could share that message of Jesus with the university. Partly because a group of Christian students from lots of churches are far better placed to do that than one church from outside the university trying to do it. And so, if you can get all the Christians from all the churches involved on campus, that could have much greater impact and accessibility than someone from outside trying to do the same thing. And so, most Christian unions, certainly in the UK and increasingly across continental Europe, will do what they call an events week, or maybe they used in the past called it a mission week. Basically, just a series of events over the course of a week where they can invite anyone from the university to come. Normally, it involves food, lunches, evening meals, a talk, connecting the Christian faith to some of the big questions of life, like the ones we've been thinking about today, opportunities to ask questions. So all the events will normally have Q&A, and then obviously lots of opportunity for discussion and for people to get to know people who are Christians. Um, and we found that actually in the last few years, like more and more people have been open to coming to those kind of events. I think for some of the reasons we said at the beginning, people have increased levels of anxiety about the future and so on. They're looking for answers. We're starting to realize that our materialistic, kind of atheistic conception of reality just doesn't cut it, and it doesn't give us any hope, and it doesn't really work. So there's a greater level of openness. And I think also most students today are not growing up in any environment where they're hearing about the Christian faith. I was chatting to someone just last week, and we sat over the table just after the talk, and he said, "Oh, I've loved coming to these events." He says, "Growing up at home, my parents would never let us talk about God. So now I'm at university, I'm just so excited to be able to find out for myself because I've never had the opportunity." And actually, that's quite typical, I would say now that um, maybe people grew up in a home where their parents were atheists. They've never had any Christian experience, and at university is the first time to actually check it out for themselves. Um, a stat I saw last week, which is interesting, was that student age people are 50% less likely to be an atheist than their parents are. So there's a definite progression of openness. So yeah, Christian unions are simply places where people are trying to give people the opportunity to do that whilst they're students, which is one of the best times in life to do it.
It's amazing. You know, you're so right. I teach Sunday school in my church, and I also go into a local primary school.
Mm,
And the first time we went in, I go in with another gentleman from church.
mm,
We were just shocked that these children actually just didn't know who Jesus was. Because you just, I don't know, from even me growing up, so I'm 24, but growing up, I was taught about Jesus in school, and it's shocking, that is, kind of
mm,
just how children might not even know who Jesus is. And like
mm,
you were saying, how amazing that they had the courage and they could come, have the courage to come and have those conversations and follow through with that desire to talk about God if they, maybe couldn't at home. And kind of on that topic, what advice would you, as someone with a lot of experience, give to someone who is scared to engage in conversations about their faith out of fear?
mm.
Or I think this is a big one, fear of being asked questions that they don't know the answers to. What advice would you give, Michael?
Uh, yeah. Firstly, I think I just want to kind of acknowledge that fear and anxiety is real, isn't it? And um, I remember someone saying, "Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the willingness to be obedient in the face of fear." And uh, so I think, there is a natural anxiety that comes from talking about Jesus. And I think, in a sense, that's because people react to the gospel different to the way they react to other things. It's one of the things that persuades me the gospel's true, one of many things.
Mm,
So, why is it that the same message about Jesus can produce such varying reactions in people from excitement, intrigue, and interest to angry hostility?
mm,
Like, what is it? I did a talk. I mean, you get less angry hostility today than you did 20 years ago, in my experience in universities, but you still get it a bit. I mean, I did a talk last week in Dundee, and I was talking to one girl after the talk, and another international student came up to me during the conversation. She just said, "I just want to say that was the worst talk I've ever heard in my life," and then progressed to kind of talk about all the reasons why she was really, really unhappy with
yes.
what I said. And it's kind of like interesting, isn't it? Like people react in such different ways. Someone else had listened to the talk and had found it the most brilliant talk they'd ever heard in their life. Same talk, same context, very different reactions.
Yep.
Um, Now, the Bible says we should expect that. It talks about how to some will be the fragrance of life and to some will be the fragrance of death. I like to say we're the Marmite of the world. Some people will love us and some people will hate us. But here's the thing, you don't know how people are going to respond, right? You can't tell by looking at someone what their response is going to be. I have no idea. So I could look at someone and think they're going to be open and interested in Christianity, and they're not. But the opposite can be the case. So my wife and I, we used to live in a block of flats in Buckinghamshire in a town called Marlow. And I remember, you get to meet their neighbours and you think like, who might be interested in Christianity or be sympathetic to the fact that I'm a professional Christian, inverted commas. And there was a 98-year-old lady in the block. And I thought, well, if anyone in the block is going to be sympathetic towards me as a Christian, it's going to be this 98-year-old lady. I mean, she's at least going to be like an Anglican, isn't she? She's going to have some kind of, nominal Christian understanding. Anyway, so we got chatting. I can't remember how it came up, but she discovered that I was a Christian. And without batting an eyelid, she just said, "Well, I'm an atheist." And she was really hostile. And we used to have some
Wow.
very interesting conversations, but she wasn't the person I was expecting to be a kind of
Mm,
hostile atheist, this very sweet 98-year-old lady. And then sometimes I meet people. I remember meeting a kind of group of lads on one campus, and they, look like a, typical group of, hard lads trying to be, like macho and everything. And then got chatting, and they were really, really open to the gospel. They were so interested and intrigued, and I'd kind of written them off because I just think, they didn't look like they'd be the kind of people who would, be interested. So all of that to say, I think our fear comes from the fact that we just don't know how people are going to respond. And if you're a pessimist like me, you assume that people are always going to respond in the most negative manner. And you don't like people responding to you negatively, so you think, well, I'll just avoid talking about it because then they won't respond negatively. Now, that is true. If you never mention your Christian faith, you'll never experience any hostility to your Christian faith. But equally, the other thing you won't experience is anyone responding positively.
Mm.
You won't get the joy of seeing people discovering Jesus for the first time and everything else. So part of the fear comes from the fact that we just don't know how people are going to respond. And in a sense, there's no easy answer other than, well, like we just have to be prepared for the fact that that will be the case. And uh, Also remember that for a lot of people in the world, being a Christian publicly in the UK and in Europe is going to have far less, a bit of social rejection is what we're facing. Can I face
Yeah,
that when my brothers and sisters in Jesus are going to face far worse for
yeah.
their Christian faith? So part of the fear is like, yeah, that's where it's coming from. But just don't assume that everyone's going to respond negatively. Um, and Yeah, some people will, and that's fine. We haven't failed, but not everyone will. And I always think of the parable of the sower. The sower, he just scatters his seed, doesn't he? Some falls on the path, doesn't grow.
Mm.
Some seems to start growing, but then it doesn't kind of bear fruit, and others bears fruit. And the lesson of the parable is not go around and try and find out which soil is good and only focus on that. It's just scatter the seed. Just talk about Jesus. Just give people the opportunity and see how people respond. And if people don't want to talk about it, fine. There are other people who will want to talk about it. Um, so
Wow.
I think fear is one factor, and I think just being realistic. Sometimes people will react negatively, and that's okay, but not everyone is going to. I
Mm.
think the second part of your question, in terms of what about if I can't answer people's questions, um, is such a common thing that people think. Like, oh, um, what if they ask me this and I don't know the answer? And I want to say to people, actually, this is amazing. It's such a good thing when people ask you questions that you can't answer. Now you're saying, well, why is it a good thing? Well, it's a good thing. Well, for lots of reasons. It's a good thing because the only way that you'll ever learn more yourself is by being asked questions that you don't know the answer to.
Mm.
Most of the study that I've done has been in response to being asked questions that I cannot answer. I have studied stuff about other religions and Islam and the origins of Islam and so on that I would have never had the motivation to study had it not been for the fact that I'd sat at some point and talked to a Muslim who'd asked me a question that I couldn't answer.
Mm.
So, for our own benefit, being asked questions is really good because it will help us to grow and learn. Now, it's also grown my confidence in the gospel because as I get asked questions and forced to go away and find out the answers, it's helped me to see actually like it stands up to questioning. Like I don't need to worry about these questions because there is stuff out there, and although I don't know it yet, there's stuff that I can discover. But the other reason why it's a great thing is when someone asks you like this question and you can't answer it, all you need to say to them is, "That's a really good question. I'm not sure of the answer, but can I get back to you?" Now, if someone says to you, "No, I don't want you to come back to me," strikes me that they're not that bothered about the question. And so you shouldn't allow them to use that question as a reason for rejecting the Christian faith. In reality, almost always people will say to me, yeah, I'd be happy for you to come back. Now, what do you then do? Well, you go away, you buy a copy of my book. No, you don't have to buy a copy of my book. I mean, there's loads of stuff out there that is
Yeah.
is helpful. You talk to other Christians, maybe older Christians or people that are particularly gifted in that area, and you find out, how you could answer their particular question, and then you go back to them. And this can work for anyone. Like even if you talk to someone on a plane and you're never going to see them again, there's a thing called email. You can drop them an email and you can keep in contact. So there's no reason why we could never go back to someone, even if we can't physically meet them again. But obviously, if it's a friend or someone we know, one of the biggest challenges in evangelism is like, how do I bring up the topic of faith? And we then think like, oh, I've got to have all my Christian conversations like in one go. Now the conversation has come up. But when someone asks you a question you can't answer, and you say to them like, "Oh, can I go away and find out and come back to you?" You've now got an excuse to bring up the topic of conversation again. A week
Mm.
later, you can say, "Oh, you know that question you asked me last week? I've been thinking about it," and then that might lead to a second conversation about the Christian faith. Now, what might happen is they might then ask you another question, and then you'll have to go away and find out the answer to that one. And then a week later, the worst that's going to happen is you're going to have weekly conversations with your friends about Jesus, and that would be
Yeah.
terrible, wouldn't it? I mean, that'd be a really bad idea. So, um, yeah, I think seriously, the, we see this as a barrier, but I just think no, it's such a good thing. It's a good thing for us because we will grow. It's a good thing for our friends because we will get to have repeated conversations. Also, it shows humility. I don't think anyone is expecting us to be in walking, talking encyclopedias, and we don't know everything, and that's fine. I remember an evangelist friend of mine, Michael Green,
Mm-hmm.
quoting John 1. He said, "The only two things that you need to be able to say as a Christian really is, I have found and come and see." Like, we're telling people, this is what I found and come and see. Um, you don't have to have all the answers to all the questions, but you have discovered something or someone, and you want to share that with others. And just one final thing, sorry, so much on this I could say.
So helpful.
Um, I think we often feel like evangelism is like this solo sport, me sharing my faith, it's me on my own. And all the other things that we do as Christians, we do together. We do Bible study together, we do worship together, we can have prayer meetings together. And then evangelism, it's like now you go off on your own. It's me and my friends. But I kind of want to change that mindset and think, well, actually, can't we do this together as well? And just as none of us have all the gifts when it comes to running a church, none of us have all the gifts when it comes to sharing the gospel. Some people are just naturally very good at answering apologetic or theological questions because that's the way they're wired, and that's great. But they may not be the most sociable or relational people.
Mm.
Some people are really gifted at being, um, hospitable, creating environments where people feel welcome and so on. But they may not be the most naturally gifted at, thinking philosophically about people's deep questions and that kind of thing. So rather than everyone having to be good at everything, why don't we just team up? Why don't we think, okay, have I got friends who are really good at answering questions? Can I get my friends who have got lots of questions to meet my friends who are really good at answering their questions?
Mm.
Maybe I could invite them both for dinner and we could all have a chat. So we don't need to all feel that we need to all be brilliant at everything, but let's just recognize that we all have different strengths and play to each other's strengths and be a team.
Wow, that is so helpful. I'm already excited for people to hear this because I'm sure they're just going to comment and say, this is so practical. This is advice that I can, actually implement in kind of my life, talking to my non-Christian friends, etc. Um, so I made the Christian Book Collective as a space for readers and writers. Because on my YouTube channel we love reading, but we also love writing. So I just wanted to ask, um, kind of for my own interest as well. Can you briefly describe, Michael, the process of writing, making sense of life? And was that process similar to the writing of your other books? For example, like What Kind of God?
Yeah. Yes, it was. And this is kind of how I've done it. This is not necessarily the way that other people would write. But I guess it's because primarily I'm a speaker before I'm a writer.
Mm.
And so all of my talks have started life, sorry, all of my books have started life as talks before they
Mm.
became books. Not every book starts that way. A lot of people just write a book. Yeah, particularly What Kind of God, but Is It True? And most recently Making Sense of Life were
Mm.
all series of talks that I'd given at university events
Ah,
weeks.
right.
And so what happened is um, I started with probably five titles. I started giving these talks, and I would have given them multiple times over the course of 1, 2, 3 years. And the beauty of that is that you get to not only give the talks and see how people respond, but you also get to hear the questions people ask. because when you write a book, you can't
Mm.
have a Q&A at the end. So you kind of have to anticipate the questions that will come up and incorporate them into the book, or at least make an appendix. Um, so doing it in real life kind of gave me the ability to kind of trial run my material, as it were, with the people I was trying to write the book for in the first place.
That's really
So
helpful.
yeah, so they started as talks, 5 talks, and then using the kind of format, it then grew from 5 to 10. So I think all my books have got 10 chapters. Um, and uh, yeah, so when it came to actually the writing process, I'd already done a lot of work. A lot of the research, a lot of the preparation had been done to deliver the talks. Now, what I discovered when I wrote my first book is that there's something quite different between spoken material and written material. Um, an extreme example of this would be, it was a evangelist friend, sorry, friend, he wasn't a friend, but an evangelist guy called John Chapman from
Mhm.
Australia. And he had a great line. He said, when we give talks, we're using the maximum number of words to explain the minimum number of ideas. But when we write books, we're using the minimum number of words to explain the maximum number of ideas.
Mm.
Now, that's an exaggeration, but there's some truth in it. And the truth is that when you're listening to a talk, you can't reread a line. Um, so if you miss it, you've lost the flow of the arguments. Whereas if you're reading a book and you don't quite get something, you can just read it again or stop and think about it. So talks will always use more words than necessary, or more words than a book, because you're giving your audience time to hear stuff. You'll say stuff in more than one way, and so on. But if you take all of that and put that into a book, it sounds really wordy. Um, The other thing I used to do when I first started writing is I used masses of exclamation marks because I was being really excited because I speak with a lot of animation. But then if you read a chapter of a book and every line has an exclamation mark at the end, it just sounds like people are shouting at you, and that's not a great way to write. So all of that to say, taking spoken content and changing it into written content was harder work than I initially thought. Although all the concepts were there and the illustrations were there, um, I had to then think, how do I make this work? And some rhetorical devices that work in speaking don't work when you're writing. Some humor only works when you're physically present with people and so on. So there are all those kind of challenges present. And then, oh, I thought of something else that was also came to my mind that was a key difference, and now I can't remember. It came into my head and then went straight out of my head.
Oh
But yeah,
no.
I think it's basically changing the content, or not changing the content, changing the approach and the style
Mm.
um, was a challenge. So what happened then is I would write it out, I would send it to a load of friends and mentors who I appreciate their feedback, and um, people who are Christians, but also friends who are not Christians, because I can, all my books have been written to try and communicate the Christian faith to people who don't know Jesus. So I think, well, I wanted people to read it who are in that kind of situation. So I would get friends or neighbors to read chapters, give feedback, we'd meet up and chat about it and hear how they were kind of responding to it. They would come back with loads of comments. I would then go back to the chapter. So I could probably write a chapter in a day. Um, but then once I had all the comments back, it would probably take me another week going through all the comments to then edit the chapter down. And then what you find is that you spend more and more time changing less and less stuff. So at the beginning, you're making really big changes. You're restructuring stuff completely. You're taking whole chapters out, that kind of thing. After a while, you're kind of tweaking a word here or some grammar there or whatever. And you get to a point where you think, okay, I've probably done enough. The
Mm.
difficulty about writing a book is like, when have you ever finished? And so in some ways,
Yeah.
it's great that a publisher gives you a deadline because otherwise you would always be working on it.
Yeah.
There's also a degree to which you can overwork a book, I've discovered. Like um
Mm.
I think you can, because you can just keep adding and adding, um, and then you add so much that it loses its original flow. So I think it's working out that time when you say, okay, I've done enough on this now. I've just got to
Yeah.
let go.
Yeah.
But I mean, you've written stuff as well, so I don't know how you found that.
The same. I think so. I had one conversation with Sam Mulberry and he said the same thing. He said
Mm.
a book will never feel finished. And it's such a relief to hear that. from published writers whose books you read and you never think to yourself, this doesn't feel finished, because
Mm,
that's potentially just a reality of writing, isn't it?
mm,
You've given some great advice there, Michael, but
mm.
do you have like one standalone kind of best piece of writing advice that you would give, maybe that you haven't mentioned already?
Oh, um,
I mean, you've already covered so much, so.
standalone piece of writing advice. Um, I don't know if it's a piece of advice, but it's a story that may be relevant. And this kind of stems back to why I wrote in the first place. Back in 2008, my first book was published. And I was chatting to an evangelist friend, Rico Tice.
Oh yeah.
And I said to Rico, what book would you give to someone who isn't a Christian to find out about the Christian faith? And he said, your book. I said, but I haven't written a book. He said, yes, that's why you need to write one. I said, why? He says, because people are more likely to read something that you've written than something someone else has
Yeah.
written. And he said, in your context, you're also going and giving lots of talks, you're meeting lots of people. So you've got an opportunity to give away books. He said, look, if no one ever even bought your book and you only just gave it away to the people you met, it would still be worth writing. And that was really the trigger that got me writing in the first place, because I was thinking, well, why should I write something like when there's so many books out there? And I thought, well, there are so many books out there, but actually, I might write something that might reach someone that wouldn't read
Mm,
something else.
mm,
And that was the original motivation. So I think recognizing that no one book is going to reach everyone, um, but there are people who I might be able to connect with through what
mm,
I write, that other people won't connect with through what they write. So rather than thinking like a very kind of arrogance, I'm going to write the book that is going to change the world. No, it might not change the world, but it might change someone's life. Um, and that's worth it. And the beauty about writing is that you write something and you put it out there, and then it just keeps on being read. It's like if I give a talk, I've got to be talking for people to hear it. Okay, so I go to the university last week in Dundee, I give a talk, I've got to be there physically. I write a book, I don't have to be there physically
mm,
for it to be having an impact on people's lives. So I think that's the beauty of it, but it's also the challenge of it because you don't see those people when you're writing. Um, and you don't always get to hear the feedback either because most people who read a book never reply to the author and say, I think of all the books that I've read in my life that I found so helpful, and I think, how many of the authors did I ever write to say, thank
yeah.
you, your book has totally revolutionized my life? Like one, maybe, because I knew him. But like, there are so many other people. It's not something we do. So it's having the confidence that we're sowing seeds that can germinate in people's hearts and lives, even though we don't necessarily see it.
Mm. That is so helpful. Thank you so much. I think especially in today's culture where especially with social media, we can see numbers and we
Mm,
might look at a YouTube video and think, oh, 1,000 views, that's not many.
mm.
That's 1,000 people. If they were stood in front of you,
Absolutely.
or if 1,000 people read a book, like that's huge, you know? You look at like the pastor of my church, he's preaching to, I don't know, 150 people, and I look around, I think, this is so many people, and each one is an individual person who's hearing this. I think changing that mindset is such helpful advice. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And finally, I asked this question at the end because I think it's really helpful. What's a good book that you read recently?
Oh, you told me you were going to ask me this question, and then when you get asked this, and when someone says, "What have you read recently?" my brain always
Goes
freezes.
blank. Yeah.
It goes blank, and I can't think of anything. And I read quite a lot. I've read several books recently. It's just that they go in right. They are there. It's just I
Yeah,
can't find them.
literally. I know
Um,
exactly what you mean.
but because it is literally sitting on my desk next to my computer, and it is the one that I've almost finished reading, I'm going to talk about this one. Um, so, but also because I am really enjoying it. So it's
Mm.
called Romans: A Letter That Makes Sense of Life by a guy called Andrew Ollerton.
Ah, yes. Yes.
I don't know. Have you ever? He'd be guy to chat to, interview you.
I actually
Interview.
heard him speak at the at a Christian literature festival last summer.
Ah,
So I do know of him. He'd be good, yeah.
yeah. We met at a conference in the autumn,
Oh,
and
great.
uh, I like the fact that the subtitle of his book is basically the title of my book, a letter that makes sense of life.
Yeah.
My book is called Making Sense of Life. But yeah, it's a book that goes through the book of Romans in the Bible, and last summer I was at a a day for Christian workers, and there was an older Christian speaking, and he was asked to give some kind of advice for people from his kind of lifetime in ministry. And he had said one of the pieces of advice he would give is don't feel the need to read through the Bible every year. And it's interesting because I've often read through the Bible in a year, 3 or 4 chapters a day, and there's benefit in that. But I think the danger of it is that we rush through the Bible so quickly every year that we never stop to actually think about what we're reading. And it can become a kind of legalistic, I've ticked the box that I've read those chapters, but we don't, if you ask me half an hour later, what did I read this morning? I can't always tell you. And so they just said, why don't you just read through bits of the Bible more slowly? And of course, when you read through the Bible more slowly, you've also got time to read books that go along with it. So, Romans is a book of the Bible I've been reading, and I thought, well, here's a book to go with it. So, every
Mm,
morning I've read a chapter. And the other thing about books, which is interesting, I've discovered, is if you read a chapter a day, you can get through so many books, can't you? And the amount of times we think to ourselves, like, oh, I just haven't got time to read because we're wanting to read the whole book in one day.
yeah,
Whereas, 20 minutes a
yeah,
day, how many books do you get through after a month?
yeah.
And then I've done something else on my phone. I put limits on my WhatsApp and Instagram, so it tells me after 15 minutes, like you've had your daily quota. And I think like how much time do I spend watching reels?
Yeah,
And they're like, and how much of an impact is that having upon my life in a positive? Well, it's not. Let's say that. So what if I was to spend a bit less time doing that, a bit more time doing reading?
that's
But yeah,
really
I would
helpful.
also highly recommend it. I also like it because Andrew is a keen mountaineer, and so he uses this analogy of climbing a mountain, going through the book of Romans, and he says like Romans 8, that beautiful passage about nothing will separate us from the love of God. It's like the
Mm,
summit of the mountain
mm,
that we ascend to. So I love climbing mountains too. So I like his analogies.
mm.
There, I would highly recommend it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That does sound good. I might have to delve into the Book of Romans using that book myself. Well, Michael, literally, thank you so much. I'm already excited to listen back to this because it's just been, I'm so thankful for your time.
That's all right. It's been a joy.